paper I'm presenting will take the time frame back by a lot. So basically, first I should also mention that this is work with my PhD student, Wang Wang, at the University of Hong Kong. So basically, we try to address two questions in this paper. The first question is, over the last 7,000 years, the geography of development in China, how much has that persisted? So that's the first question. The second question is, if there has been a lot of persistence over the last 5,000 years or longer, then what have been the main drivers to allow the persistence to continue? I would say probably for the most part, the second question is where more of the focus is. So to begin with, let me just give you a sense of what we are trying to do. So these two maps, are as follows. The first one on the left-hand side shows the geographic distribution of the 128 walled cities that existed on today's Chinese territory between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. So you can see that most of the walled cities are the so-called urban centers that emerged more than 4,000 years ago on Chinese land, were mostly located in the central plains, in the northern central plains, along both the Yellow River, which is given by this blue line at the top, and then also along the Yangtze River, sort of cutting across central China. So this is what the sort of geography of the early developers or early, developing places in China. By the way, by a walled city here, we mean, this is the definition given by archaeologists, and within a settlement that is enclosed either with stone walls or earth walls or some defensive canal for the same purpose of protecting the property and the people within. So that's what the things look like more than 4,000 years ago. And then on the right-hand side, we have this map showing the distribution of nightlight luminosity or nightlight density in 2010, just 12 years ago. So you can roughly see a lot of similarity in terms of the geographical distribution of relative developmental advancements today in China and 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So this is the sort of the first observation that made us interested in the questions that I just mentioned earlier. And then this pair of maps show the progression of elite human capital production across China. So this first map on the left shows the birthplaces of all those philosophers or inventors of the school of thoughts, about 2,500 years ago in China, including Confucius, who came from this part here. And then around his time, there were the so-called hundreds of schools of thought. So you can see that the birthplaces of all those inventors of Chinese philosophies from 2,500 years ago, either were along the Yellow River or along the Yangtze River. Okay, so nobody came from southern China for that matter. And then that was 2,500 years ago. So let's move a little bit closer to us. So this is the the Tang Dynasty distribution of all the famous poets, because for Chinese schools, there is a so-called collection of 300 most famous Tang Dynasty poems. So we located the birthplaces for all the 80-some poets who contributed, in some cases, multiple poems to the famous classic collection of poems from that period. So now you can see like the spread, there was more spread out in relative terms of intellectual elites production, but still most of them were either from the north of China or central China along the Yangtze River, with a few exceptions from the south. So this roughly reflects the intellectual elite production landscape for China about 1,200 years ago. Okay, so I guess from the two sets of maps, you can roughly get the picture. Okay, so the questions again we want to address here now we extend it to three. First, has historic, prehistoric development had persistent impact on subsequent outcomes in economic performance and human capital achievement? Okay, and if yes, what explains the long-term persistence? And then more importantly, what are the transmission mechanisms through which prehistoric development has continued to influence subsequent development across China? So the main findings are as follows. First of all, development in particular in the late Neolithic. So that means between 3000 and 1700 BCE has continued to impact economic and human capital geography in subsequent periods. So in that sense, early China, because for a lot of the archaeologists in China and outside, they have been fascinated with this question, when did the first early China really emerge? So according to our quantitative data analysis, the early China, somehow appeared roughly 5,000 years ago, but not much earlier than that. Secondly, the closer a region is to 7 prehistoric cradles of civilization, the more prosperous and the higher its population density throughout Chinese history, or at least all the way up to the late 19th century, when the modernization movement really started, after China failed in the Opium War with the British, and then China was forced to open, and then that really started to change much of the persistence. And then those regions that were that are close to the 7 prehistoric cradles of civilization had more success in human capital achievement, both in terms of elite politicians and also elite intellectual producers in terms of book authors, basically of the last 2,000 years. So we find also that culture as proxied by the number of years of Sinicization, or defined differently, the number of years under China's rule for a prefecture. If we use that as a proxy for how much influence that place, that prefecture has had by the Chinese culture, whatever that means, I will come back to this in a moment, is a major channel for the transmission of early civilizational development and for this its persistent impact over the last several thousand years. So just a quick literature review. As all of you know, Jared Diamond started much of this whole literature on real long-term historical development, in particular historical persistence from prehistoric times to nowadays. According to much of his work, countries with the prehistoric environments that were most suitable for agriculture to be either adopted or invented entered agriculture early and still have a higher per capita income, even in recent history. And then Potterman, through a sequence of his own work and his co-authored papers with others, show that countries that adopted farming earlier still have higher population density, higher urbanization ratio, and higher per capita GDP in the 1500s. And then in their other work, they show that even as recent as the early 2000s, these countries that started agriculture early and also that established a centralized state authority early have higher income today. A very interesting paper published in 2002 by Davis and Weinstein. They use data from Japan to show that the role and rank correlations between the Stone Age geography of population density in Japan and the new geography of population density as of 1998 are respectively as high as 0.53 and 0.31. They spend a lot of efforts trying to understand why such a long-term persistence has been possible in Japan. And then there have been a lot of studies, I'm not going to take too much time here, that look at transmission channels, including institutions, education and human capital accumulation, and then culture and or cultural values as well. Okay, so let me go through very quickly some major periods of development just to help us grasp the kind of appreciate the main conclusions we want to show you. So China did not end hunting gathering until about 9,000 years ago. That's when China entered the Neolithic age by settling. The early Chinese humans were settling down and domesticating plants and animals. This map on the right-hand side shows the distribution of both walled cities represented by the purple dots and archaeological sites that came from this period, according to archaeologists. So for this period between 9,000 and 5,000 BCE, so far 13 walled cities have been discovered, and about 425 archaeological sites have been discovered as well from this period. So we use the density of each color or the intensity of each color here to represent the different levels of archaeological site density per 10,000 square kilometers. So as you can see, for this period, there was not really much population, neither was there a lot of development, in particular the walled cities at this time. Even though there were 13 of them, they were very tiny, so not so big. Then if we move to the next phase, that is the middle Neolithic, between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE, then we have 56 walled cities that have been discovered from this period. And then about 7,000 archaeological sites that have been discovered and recorded. Oh, by the way, over the last 2 years, I have had a big army of research assistants digitizing all the archaeological discovery data. So we have data for now over 100,000 archaeological sites covering different periods from China. But now, by this let me move on quickly. So by the late Neolithic, meaning between 3000 and 1700 BCE. So now there are many more green areas, meaning population density as represented by archaeological site density, at least across the northern prefectures, is much higher during this time. And then there are many more walled cities, as I mentioned earlier. And then after the late Neolithic, then China entered the Bronze Age. But this time in particular, we focus on the Shangzhou period between 1700 and 221 BCE. So now there are many, many green areas and a lot more walled cities, 855 of them. In our database, we have 24,214 archaeological sites covering this period, and also the first written language started to appear. This is something I want to emphasize here because it's very important. The first written language in China appeared during the second millennium BCE, because this really constrains what we can actually use when we talk about how much the prehistoric development has impacted the subsequent development, because there's no written record of anything from the prehistoric period going back 4,000, 5,000, or 7,000 years ago. So we have to rely on other things. Okay, so let me first show you evidence on the persistence. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use population density as a proxy for each region's economic development level. So this is our first outcome variable. And then we use 269 prefectures across China proper as the basis. So this is based on the 1820 administrative zoning done by the Qing government. Okay, and then in particular, we want to use each prefecture's archaeological site density during a period as a proxy for for that prefecture's population density during that period of time. Okay, so for the mid-Neolithic, late Neolithic, and the Shangzhou period, for these three early periods, this is how we're going to do it. And then for subsequent periods, or for the historic periods, then for the year 2 CE and 754, 976, 1102, and 1393, 1580, and so on. We use different historians' estimates for the regional populations across China at each respective time. Okay, so we have been asked a lot this question: how accurate, how much confidence can we really have in using archaeological site density to proxy for the population density for each region? So this is because for the Han Dynasty period during 206 BCE and 220 CE, we have both archaeological site data and population estimates, at least for the year 2 CE. Okay, so this vertical axis stands for the estimated population density for the different prefectures as of 2 CE. That's the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis is the archaeological site density covering from the same period. So from this chart, you can see that even though definitely there are measurement errors, because as you can see, like there were some archaeological sites that were probably heavily populated, whereas there were other sites that would have just a few people, but nonetheless, we'll just count and treat each site the same as every other site, just count it once. So this confirms more or less that our proxy choice for prehistoric periods maybe it's not so bad. So that's so now first, just like Davis and Weinstein, we want to use raw correlation and rank correlation between the population in a prehistoric period and each of the subsequent historical periods. So you can see the raw correlation if we use the late Neolithic population density as a benchmark, then calculate the correlation in population between between the late Neolithic and each subsequent point in population density. That this is what it looks like. So even as of 2010, the regional population density still has a 20% correlation with the late Neolithic population density as proxied by archaeological site density. So this next chart gives us a very easy to remember impression. So the two red lines stand for the raw correlation that's at the bottom, and then the rank correlation between the late Neolithic population density and each subsequent period's population density. So they have been different ups and downs, but in the interest of time, let me not spend too much time there. But of course, correlation-based evidence of persistence is subject to a lot of criticism. For example, we know that there may be some geographic factors and climate-related factors that made some place very conducive to early development. Those places may also be good places to live in, just maybe like Melbourne or Sydney. Somehow, the early immigrants, early immigrants decided to settle there, maybe because of the climate and the ruggedness level and so on. So for that reason, we want to introduce a lot of controls and provincial fixed effects. We control for the geographical characteristics such as ruggedness, terrain ruggedness, and then climate in terms of average temperature each year and average precipitation, and then agricultural suitability indices for different crops, and also the distance to political capitals and agricultural suitability for New World crops and so on. So after we control for this geographic, climate, and other factors, as well as the fixed effects, then we look at the predictability of prehistoric population density for each prefecture, or of using that to predict each subsequent population density level. So if we use the mid Neolithic population density as the starting point to predict future population densities, then that predictability goes into becomes insignificant after 1393. But if we use the late Neolithic population density as the starting point to predict future population density levels, then the significance level is high at 1% level up to 1851. So what this means is that so after the modernization movements, including the introduction of industrial technology and also global trade, because after the Opium War, China had to open its markets to international trade. So with such changes, then the long-term persistence that had lasted for more than 4,000 years became insignificant. But then anyway, so this gives us a somewhat more robust a piece of evidence showing persistence even after we control for such different factors and fixed effects, we still have a significant persistence lasting at least until the late 19th century. So now let's use
5 minutes remaining.
Oh, okay. So, okay, let me show some additional. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So let me try to go a little bit deeper. That is, yeah, we established evidence of persistence. Is that a coincidence, or is there economic, social, scientific explanations or reasons behind it? So here, I want to emphasize what has been discussed in the literature on complex societies in human history, how they jump-started the civilizational processes. So here, the main thing to focus on is that there are those settlements that were fortified with defensive structures. They not only, well, maybe initially the intention was to protect the people within and also protect property so that no invaders from other tribes, other proto-states would be able to kill them or kill the people within or steal things. But once those walled cities were formed to make the population density within the walled settlements much higher than before, so that would make the social structuring really necessary. Otherwise, violence and infighting would be a constant struggle for the people living within the walled cities. So that's how and why the areas that were enclosed with a lot of people living in, they are what we call the prehistoric cradles of civilization, because they started to move more aggressively to develop more structured way of life, and especially structure the enclosed societies to establish law and order. So we use the 7 biggest cradles of civilization. We require that each walled city should have 1 square kilometer in site area. Altogether, we have 13 of them from the late Neolithic, and then 5 of them are redundant because there are others nearby. So we picked 7 unique ones out of the 128. Then we use the this is what the 7 cradles of civilization look like in terms of the locations. Then we use the shortest distance of each prefecture to the 7 cradles as the explanatory variable. So you can see that this shortest distance to the 7 cradles, even after we include all the controls and fixed effects, it's statistically significant at the 1% level, all the way up to 1851. Okay, but after that, then it's no longer significant. Then we also look at other outcome variables, as I mentioned, senior official density, and then book author density for each region. And here we establish even stronger persistence because here, when we use the last 40 years of all the
1 minute.
Okay, I'm gonna. Okay, so let me jump to the transmission mechanism. So we have a very clever proxy here to try to see what channel, what transmission channel allowed that persistence to really work. So we use the number of years under China's rule or a Sinic state's rule since 1700 BCE as a measure of the intensity of Chinese cultural influence in that prefecture. So this is what the this proxy variable looks like. The dark red areas have been in the Chinese Empire almost from the very beginning. And then the surrounding areas have slightly lighter red, and then all the peripheral regions are further away from the center. So it turns out this a proxy for the transmission channel is actually very significant in our two-stage regression analysis. But anyway, so
thank you, Zhiwu. That was a heroic attempt to get through all of that stuff and such a phenomenal period of history as well. We don't have time for any questions, unfortunately, because we've used up the time. So moving to Pushkar's paper next. But if people would like to catch up with Zhiwu and ask any questions, of course, they're able to do that in the chat or in outside of the sessions. So thank you again, Zhiwu. Pushkar, are you able to share your screen? Fantastic. If you want to get underway, that'd be great.
Right. Okay. Thank you, David. First of all, let me thank Lionel and the other organizers for including this paper. I really enjoyed the sessions. Yesterday, Andre presented such a wonderful paper on the railroads in Australia, and some of these issues about gauge and the timing was fantastic. And this morning, Rebecca presented this paper on, things, the more things change, the less they do. So it's fascinating, absolutely. So I'm going to have a more economics view of things. And this paper is also about railroads. It is about British investment in railroads in the colonial era. But instead of looking at what the effects were, the contemporaneous effects of railway development in India, I'm going to look at the effects 150 years on. First of all, this is joint work with William Yu. William was my honor student a couple of years back, and he's since moved into greener pastures. But I felt, personally, I really enjoyed this whole topic, and so I thought I'll continue working with it. Okay, so we now know, I don't have to talk to this group, but history matters, right? There's this persistent impact of historical institutions. And just now we saw this wonderful paper by Zhiwu, sorry if I'm pronouncing her name incorrectly, about really long-term effects of things that have happened in history. So there are these long-term consequences of historical events and institutions on current-day economic outcomes. There are lots of examples, and I'm not going to go through all of those examples. And basically to say that the regions and places that were more advanced in the pre-industrialized times have maintained their preeminence today. And that leads us to this whole debate about the role, the long-term effects of colonialism and colonial institutions, right? And this is kind of what this paper is looking at, a particular colonial institution, and what are the long-term effects of that institution. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about railways in India. And in particular, the long-term effects of building of the railway infrastructure in colonial India by the British government during the period 1853 to 1930. Okay, so the first commercial railways in India started in 1853. The first commercial train ran. And that's very interesting because Andre talked about the first commercial railway in Australia in 1854. So basically it was being, railways were introduced all around the world at the same time. This is absolutely fascinating. And starting from 1853, by 1908, Britain had invested about 274 million pounds of capital in Indian railways, making it the single largest investment program undertaken in the British Empire. Right, and it is known to be the largest infrastructural investment in any country in history. So railways made up of 80% of Britain's industrial investment in India. It was not universally welcome. In fact, for example, Gandhi was not a supporter of railways. British motivations, and this is going to be useful when we talk about endogeneity and selection issues, were in this order, and this is what I've been reading over the last few years. Military requirements always dominated all other reasons for investing in railways and building railway lines. Okay, so the most important was always railways, followed by commercial, and then social. This is kind of in the order of importance. Okay, what were the impacts? The immediate impact was on trade and development in a predominantly agricultural India. So it decreased trade costs and interregional price differences. It increased interregional and international trade. And most importantly, as Donaldson has this wonderful paper, talks about how it increased contemporaneous real income levels. Okay. It made real incomes less responsive to local shocks, thereby reducing the effect of famines in the 19th century. There's some effects, positive effects on male and English literacy in colonial India. Sanyal, who wrote this thesis on the railway development in 1930, said that, as a result of the railway development, the stationary state of India ceased to exist. And he also says that, in the medium run, kind of railways contributed to the Indian independence movement as it was one unifying force across a very heterogeneous country at that point in time. So, what do we do in this paper? So this paper, we show that these positive effects of railways have persisted over more than a century. So how do we do this? So we have data, we start with the data collected by Donaldson. And what he did was he geocoded each segment, about 20 kilometers long, of the railway network, and also noted the area in which each segment was opened. Okay, so what we did was we matched each location in that Donaldson data to the current, as of 2013, districts in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, right? And that basically gives us a measure of the length of exposure of railways at the district level in the modern day South Asia. Okay, and we examine whether this length of exposure, whether the length of exposure is associated with local economic development or an increase in district level prosperity at the present. Okay, by present, I'm always going to mean 2013. So very briefly, the history of Indian railways in 1844, the idea was proposed by the mercantile firms in London and Manchester, but surprisingly was opposed by the board of directors of the East India Company, who were essentially the kind of rulers of India at that point in time. Then comes Lord Dalhousie, who is the Governor General of India from 1848 to 1854, I think. And he is a big supporter of railways. And he writes these railway minutes, and which comes out in 1853, where he kind of has a very strong, very strongly advocates for the growth of railways in India. And kind of he's the driving force behind railways. And in 1853, we had the first passenger train that runs between Bombay and Thane, Mumbai and Thane in April 1853. And that, what people say, began a railway revolution in India. So I'm not going to, this is the map about, this is the kind of which are the current districts and when were they exposed to railways. And this is kind of the, kilometers of railway lines in each of the current districts in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And you see this huge variation. But what is interesting is this line. It started off with about 30 kilometers line in 1850, goes up to more than 60,000 kilometers by 1930. So you see this huge amount of investment. And this is the percentage of districts that were connected in each 5-year period, starting from 1853. Sorry. And the interesting thing is this peak between 1858 and 1862, and then some peaks in the 1885 and so on. So this was this big spurt, the initial spurt, and the argument what I have been reading is that, after the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, where the British initially suffered a lot of losses, they realized that, look, they can't move troops fast enough. And that kind of led to a lot of reverses that they experienced in, say, Lucknow and Delhi, far away from where the main troops were based. So they started building these railway lines to move troops very quickly. And the initial railway lines were along this Gangetic Plain, linking Kolkata to Delhi and so on, all the way to Punjab, and also linking Kolkata to Bombay, which was the main port. So basically getting the ships would land in the Bombay docks and then kind of bring in people and the military from Bombay into Kolkata and other parts of India. Okay, so let's see. Now, what is the outcome variable? To me, the problem is this: it's very difficult to get consistent data on economic outcomes at kind of a level which is lower than the the state level. So at the district level, that's what we are going to talk about. Part of the problem is across India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, data collection is not standardized. There is strategic data collection and data reporting in many countries. So what we do is we don't go into economic data for most part of our paper. We look at the robustness of our results. I don't think I'll have time to talk about those. So what we do is we use night lights. And it's kind of the lights that Zhiwu talked about initially, and when he had this first map to show about the fortified cities 2000 years back, and the night lights as of 2010. So what we use is night lights, which basically provides a consistent metric to measure prosperity across districts, across countries. It's non-strategic and so on. So what is night light? This is a time series. The night light time series data is available from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Geophysical Data Center. They collect data up to a value of 63. So each pixel is given a digital number from 0 to 63. And using these digital numbers, what we do is the total light emitted from a region can be calculated by adding up all these individual values of the pixels. And what we get is this sum of lights. And what we do in this paper, the outcome variable used is log of 1 plus sum of lights, the addition of 1 to account for the fact that, some cases it just so happens to be 0, maybe this measurement error. So we add this 1. So this is the distribution, geographical distribution of night lights as of 2013. And pardon my, it's basically my inability to kind of change the colors very well. The darker ones, the black ones, the really high night lights, it is the so-called brighter areas, have more night lights. And this is as of 2013, and they're consistent with our priors. The region around Kolkata is highly, lit up. This Bombay, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai corridor is highly lit up, as is the Delhi, Punjab corridor. So it's kind of consistent with what we know about economic development in current South Asia. Okay, we use other outcome variables is mean lights. We use aggregate bank deposits at the district level for India only. We use rural and urban poverty rates at the district level in India. We use district level averages of human capital, health, and education attained. But they kind of systematically support our results that railway development, the exposure to railways has had a positive impact over 100 years later. So this is kind of, that tells you the story of the paper. The rest of the paper is kind of trying to understand this a bit more. So this plot, this is the L-poly plots, locally weighted polynomial plots of time of decade of introduction of railways in the district and night lights. One log of 1 plus night lights, and see this strong negative effect. The lower, the smaller the exposure, the lower the exposure, the lower is the night lights of economic prosperity as of 2030. So this is kind of, this tells you the story of what I'm trying to going to say in the rest of the paper. Okay, it's summary of everything. But then what we do is some regression specification. We use this decade of introduction of railways because we don't have to, we don't require any functional forms, etc. Where the kind of the reference category is that the district was either connected after 1930 or was not has not been connected until 1960. So this is there are 7 dummies. Either the district is connected between 1850 and 1860, or 1860s and 70, 70 and 80, 80 to 90, and so on, all the way to 1930. Okay. This includes all districts in and all time periods between 1992 and 2013. So we allow for time fixed effects and state and country fixed effects. So a lot of our results restrict us, in a lot of our analysis, we restrict ourselves to 2013, where we exclude this time fixed effects, that the year fixed effect. So this is the basic regression, and these are the variables. These betas are the other coefficient that I'm going to be interested in. So this is, and what we have is additional controls. For all regressions, we include latitude and longitude of the district. For some regressions, for the India regressions, we include coastal district. We use the CV of the ruggedness of the district. We have some post-independence control, the proportion of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in the district based on 2011 census data. And then we have this pre-independence control, whether the district was under direct British rule or was under indirect British rule, or what is called the princely states of India. Okay, about 55% of the country was under direct British rule. The rest was under this indirect rule, where the princely state, known as princely state, like local king was on power, there was a British resident and so on. So standard errors, we use state cluster standard errors, we have spatially clustered standard errors, and we get similar standard errors irrespective of what is used. And the regressions results I present, we're going to use the state cluster standard errors. So this is the main results, railway connectivity and district prosperity in 2013. So this is the regression results, the coefficient estimates, the beta estimates that from here, the beta estimates from here. These are for all districts in South Asia, including Pakistan and Bangladesh. This is for India only, and it's consistent with the locally weighted polynomial regression that I saw, what I showed. You know, the longer the exposure, early exposure has a stronger effect on local economic development today. Okay. We have alternative measures of prosperity, and the results are consistent. We can talk about them later. If anyone's interested, I can show the graphs later on. Okay. We want to also check, look, it could just be we're just, somehow getting these results, right? We want to check that we are not erroneously rejecting the null hypothesis of no effect of introduction of railway. So what we do is this falsification test. So what we do here is kind of randomly reassign districts to different railway introduction dates. I create a set of fake railway introduction effects, and we randomly assign year of introduction to districts and estimate the basic equation for all districts. We keep the proportion of districts connected in each district as per the actual proportion. And we repeat this exercise 10,000 times to give us these 10,000 estimates of these betas. For each regression, we get these 10,000 estimates of these betas. And what are these called? These are these placebo coefficients. And if we were erroneously rejecting the null hypothesis that our coefficient of interest is equal to 0, then we should observe that the placebo coefficient should be very close to the true coefficient, right? So this is the distribution of this placebo coefficient, and the dotted line is the true coefficient. They are not very close. They are kind of centered around 0. These placebo coefficients are centered around 0. Basically, there is no effect in this fake introduction, fake measures of railway introduction, and they're not close to 0. For what we can say is we are not erroneously rejecting the null hypothesis. The other thing that we find is that there's this big difference between whether railways are introduced pre-1880 or post-1880. And that's kind of, the effects are all stronger if the railways were introduced in the district pre-1880 relative to if they were district introduced post-1880, irrespective of what specification we consider. This is different specification, different controls, and so on. But basically, irrespective of what we do, effects were stronger pre-1880 relative to post-1880. So why 1880 turns out is quite a watershed in the history of Indian railways. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Just the two things that stood out post 1880. One was, so 1880 saw a structural change in the development of Indian railways. So post 1880, there was this change in the financing arrangement and what is called this new guarantee system. And R.C. Dutt talks about it post 1880. You had these thugs, basically the speculators and thugs coming in and going about investing in railways wherever they wanted without any big plan, which, say, for example, the British government had pre-1880. And because there was a guaranteed, the returns were guaranteed, they kind of went about and invested any way they wanted. So that was the first reason. And the second reason was post 1880, most of the railway lines that were built post 1880 were either narrow gauge or meter gauge, as opposed to the broad gauge lines pre-1880. And Lord Dalhousie had introduced these broad gauge lines, and I know Lionel is laughing, and we've had, yesterday Andre was talking about this gauge difference across different province states of Australia, and I think, oh wow, this is exactly what happened in India, right, during that time. So post 1880, most of these lines were meter gauge, and actually, from whatever I've been reading, post-independence, a lot of the investment in Indian railways by the government of India was basically to kind of unify the gauge, right? To convert these narrow gauge and meter gauge lines into broad gauge lines. So essentially the original lines, the new meter gauge lines were not connected to the ports, so there were not enough trade, and there's additional hassle to kind of move goods and things to these states and to the ports. Connectivity was much bigger problem, and that kind of led to lower prosperity for these districts. Okay, while we cannot draw a causal link with either of these, in the long run difference in productivity, both possibly accounted in some way, but the next thing is this, whenever we're talking about a place, infrastructure, we have to talk about endogeneity. The endogeneity or the placement of railway lines. So if railways were first introduced in districts that had greater economic potential, so early railways, you invest in districts that have greater economic potential, this basically what you're finding is hysteresis, right? This could possibly explain the large contemporaneous and long-term impacts. Okay, so we need to kind of rule that out. And for that, we need to go do an instrumental variable estimation. And what is the instrument that we're going to use? So we go back to the motives for railway expansion, and with the motives for railway expansion, remember the military, commercial, and social. So we focus on military expansion, and what we do, so the military motive for building railways during the British Raj always triumphed the economic motives. Okay, the initial spurt, as I said, was right after the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, where troops had to be moved quickly. And the expansion of railways to the northwest after 1865 was kind of driven by the great game against Russia in response to Russia's annexation of territories in Central Asia and the construction of Trans-Caspian railways. Okay, so what we do is we kind of go back and look at where the army cantonments were built by the British. So the darker shaded district denote the present day districts of India that were connected before as of 1880. And these red dots denote the location of the army cantonments as of 1864. So what we use as instrument is the distance of the centroid of any particular district to the nearest army cantonment. So if it was close to an army cantonment, it is likely to be connected early. So districts closer to the army cantonment. So it's kind of unrelated. The placement of the army cantonments was unlikely to be correlated with the current day, the contemporaneous economic state prosperity of those districts, okay, of those locations. And the first stage estimates in this OLIV says a 1,000-kilometer increase in the minimum distance of this from the centroid of the district to the army cantonment is associated with 11.3 percentage point reduction in the likelihood that the district is connected by 1883. So these are the OLS estimates. The IV estimates are much larger, but the OLS estimates are still positive and statistically significant, right? So basically what we are saying is the IV OLS estimates kind of sort of provides a lower bound to the effects of connections pre-1880 on long-term prosperity. It's not zero, it still is a significant effect, but it provides a lower bound on the true effects. What is driving these results? And we argue that, look, it's possibly because of agglomeration effects or first mover effects, what's also called the returns to scale effects. Initial districts that were connected had this first mover advantage, and other districts were unable to catch up, and these positive effects persist for more than a century. And what we do is we use population density of the district as a measure of this agglomeration effects, right? So this is the population density of the district in 1901. Districts connected pre-1880 have a higher population density in 1901, and also consistently a higher population density between 1901 and 2001. So it starts off, the railways lead to initial increase in population density, and that persists over time. This is the kind of first mover advantage and agglomeration effects that people have been talking about. The other things that we do, what happened in the intermediate period? The intermediate period, this is data between 1960 and 1990, and what we saw is railways connected, districts connected pre-1880 had higher literacy rates, right? So that kind of contributes again to higher prosperity as of 2030. So I'm going to stop now. So what we find is that districts that were connected early continue to have higher levels of local economic prosperity. And the other results, I haven't showed these results: lower rural poverty a century later, more men and women have education, fewer men and women are malnourished, and the effects stronger for women, interestingly, both for malnourishment and for education. And there are also these effects of considerable geographical spillovers. Districts further from the connected districts are worse off in terms of economic development as of 2013, and the IV estimates are larger. So results appear to be driven by the first mover advantage and is consistent with the notion of positive long-run effects of trade and development. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Well done, Pushkar. That's 20 seconds to spare. So there's 5 minutes for questions or comments. I wonder, Pushkar, if you wouldn't mind not sharing your screen. So
okay, sure. Sorry. Yeah.
And if people have any questions or comments, if they can show their hand or yell out. Florian.
How is the expansion of the railroad linked with other technology? And I'm thinking here of someone of the telegraph, given that is always fairly closely linked to railroads in a lot of countries. And so would that be effectively what you do, kind of saying it's like, well, we're just catching this because like whatever the telegraph does, the railroad does at the same time, and so it's just included in the effect? Or do you think there's like a significantly distinct effect, the sense that saying that like if we could isolate that in some form, we will probably find something else about like this infrastructure that is related to the railroad, but it's not effectively the railroad in itself?
I don't have an answer right now, Florian. I listened to your talk yesterday, and I kind of knew you I saw your expansion of post office, and that's exactly right. The post office and the telegraph system.
Yeah,
that's kind of the people have talked about the expansion of that. There is, I haven't, to be honest, seen. I don't know this literature but that is kind of. It's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer to it. It's classic. I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. It was just really kind of like the
next project, maybe.
Yeah.
A good question, and I was listening to you yesterday, and I thought, oh,
yep.
This is and about the same time, right?
Yeah. They're coming around the same time. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Fantastic. Any other comments, questions? Thank you, Pushkar. That was a really interesting paper. So two interesting papers looking at that development in different time zones and different locations, but great to see. Our next paper is being presented by Jessica Vechbanyongratana. I hope I've said that correctly, who's looking at property rights and land markets in Siam, consequences of the 1901 Land Title Deed Act. I'll hand it over to you, Jessica. Feel free to share your screen. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you're all seeing that and you're all hearing me okay.
Looks great.
Perfect. So we've heard two papers, one on the very long run, one on the long run, and I'm rounding this out with a paper on the short run. And however, the paper itself is probably the longest run project of the three. This paper I actually started about a decade ago, and I saw Sumner had popped in earlier today, and he probably would have remembered commenting on the very early draft of this paper in 2014. That's a bit embarrassing to say, but as I talk about the data, I'll say something about kind of why that is and why it's been so long term, but we're finally seeing, or I'm finally seeing the end of the light at the end of the tunnel in this one. So I am going to be talking about property rights and land markets in Siam. And so the main research questions are, with the introduction of a Western land code and full private property rights in land in 1901, did land market activity in Bangkok and surrounding provinces increase? And then do we see some shifts in the importance of particular plot characteristics that are associated? Sorry about that. Hold on just a second. I have lost my, there we go, lost my connection there. Okay, so do we see that plot characteristics associated with land transfers actually shift after the Land Act is enacted? So I need to start with a little bit of historical context, and so we can understand where these property rights, shift in property rights come from. And I'll start with a little bit about the historical governance structure of Siam. Siam had a traditional Southeast Asian mandala system in the 19th century, where there is a core, in this case, it's controlled by Bangkok, and Bangkok had very strong direct control over the surrounding provinces, but didn't have a whole lot of direct control over peripheral provinces, and the governance structure was quite decentralized. And part of that in some other papers that are related to the rail paper that we just listened to had to do with actually difficulty with transportation. So there was very indirect types of control, and political influence was correlated with distance. And the problem with that is that it made the outer areas that were under Siamese influence basically ripe for the picking by the British and the French colonial governments. And so what we saw is that in the second half of the 19th century, the French and the British kind of progressively annexed more and more territory that was previously under Siamese influence. And King Chulalongkorn then adopted several different defensive strategies to establish and maintain sovereignty for Siam towards the end of the 19th century. The big one is centralizing the government and bringing all of these peripheral areas that were left under direct control of the government. But another strategy that the king followed was actually the adoption of several different Western institutions. And part of this was to gain international legitimacy. And one of the institutions that was adopted was this Western Land Code in 1901. And so in 1901, we have the passage of the 1901 Land Title Deed Act. And in this, we had the establishment of the Torrens system of land administration with titling based on cadastral survey. And this is something that we borrowed from Australia. And then they also introduced new centralized authorities to oversee this land administration. To understand the impact of this Land Act, we actually have to go back into the 19th century to understand the traditional land rights in Siam. Traditional land rights were based on rights of usufruct, and land deeds were issued to cultivators who cleared land and proved to the local government officials that they had made plots quite productive within 3 years. And so you can think of this as being very similar to like the Homesteading Act in the United States, where you could go basically make a land claim and then make it productive, and then you would get the land rights to that piece of land. So as long as the taxes were paid on this land annually, landowners had the right to use the land for agricultural activities, but it's very important for me to state that it's only the activity that's stated on the deed, and it's very particular activities such as rice cultivation or orchard cultivation or garden crop cultivation. You could also use this land as collateral, as well as transfer the properties to new owners, either through sales or bequests. So there's been a lot of, several scholars in the past who have argued that land rights were not secure under these traditional rights. And so I've spent some time with my colleague, Dr. Tanya Pornchangkrachang, also from Chulalongkorn University, and evaluating the land rights security of traditional land rights in Siam. And what we found is that on 3 dimensions, it's actually quite secure. Expropriation risk is minimal, and this is evidenced by the fact that people are choosing to cultivate long-term orchard crops, as well as evidence of compensation for eminent domain. We also kind of rule out insecure and ill-defined property rights because there's very systematic land record keeping throughout the 19th century, as well as formal arbitration processes. And then also people had the right to use land as collateral, and this was given in law and also observed a lot in practice. However, one area where there was some land rights insecurity was that individuals had the risk of deed loss if they stopped maintaining the crop or changed the land use to something that is not specified in the deed. And so this is the big difference between the traditional rights before 1901 and then what happens after 1901. So just to summarize that, before 1901, we had usufruct rights in land. These were transferable rights, but there was risk of loss due to lack of crop maintenance and land use change. And then after 1901, we have what we think of as these full sort of Western style full private property rights in land. These were still transferable rights. And there was very much so a reduced risk of deed loss since ownership was no longer tied to agricultural use. So the hypothesis is that the reduced risk of loss would diversify potential productive activities for land in Bangkok and surrounding areas, which in turn should increase land market activity, particularly in the more urban areas. So if you have a piece of land that is slated as like orchard land, but it's in the middle of a commercial district, we would expect that that piece of land might be sold once that restriction is taken off so that it can be used for commercial land. Okay, so here's my hypotheses that first of all, that the introduction of full private property rights through this 1901 Act will lead to increased land market transactions just in general, but then also I hypothesize that the characteristics of the transacted land will be consistent with non-agricultural commerce and trade activities after 1901. So for example, proximity to canals and irrigation canals wouldn't be as important because these are important for orchard cultivation. And I'll get into the data in a moment because I'm looking at orchards. However, the proximity to the rivers and also the newly dug roads would be more important. These are commercial areas in Bangkok. And so I'm expecting to see more transactions in these types of areas. Also, districts that have less agricultural activity, I would also expect to see more land market activity. Okay, so let me just give you a brief history of this particular project. And this goes with the theme of the conference. It was actually 10 years ago in 2012. I was trying to find data. There's not that much work that's done in Thai economic history, although that's now changing over the last decade. And I couldn't get into the National Archives for a whole host of different reasons. And so I decided to go and visit different museums to see what types of collections that they had. And so I stumbled into the Department of Lands Museum and found these two big cabinets with locked cabinet doors. And I believe I may have been, no, I think it was the AHEC conference, not this conference. I was actually at the conference, and the RA that was working with me at the time called me and said, the curator opened the cabinets. He found the key, he opened the cabinets, and what we found were 30,000 land deeds from the 1880s and another 2,500 land deeds from the 1850s. And so, you know, I came back to Bangkok, I looked at these and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with these, but I'm just going to collect it. So I got a very small grant to take basically photographs of all these things. And so I love this cartoon because this basically was my strategy. Just get all the information you can and we'll think of a use for it later. And that's pretty much what ended up happening. So anyway, so the data that's collected is the garden title deeds. That's what they translate it to English. And these were orchard deeds that were issued between 1884 and 1889 during a comprehensive orchard tax reassessment. Usually these were done only once a reign. And so this was done in the reign of King Chulalongkorn. And he ordered it in 1882. These deeds were in use until 1908, and there was another land law change in 1908, and so they kind of scrapped all of these and then reissued new deeds after that date. There were, we collected 29,465 deeds, and I believe there were probably about 50,000 initially. These are the ones that survive and are kept at the Department of Land's museum. And these deeds served two purposes. These were ownership documents for orchards, primarily areca or betel nut. These were also tax documents, and so the taxes were assessed per tree, and then they would count up the taxes, and that's what you owed on an annual basis. And these records included quite a few characteristics about the plot, including the location, the size, the tax assessment, which is highly correlated with the number of trees on the plot, border properties, as well as bordering land features. And then there's a few details about the owners, including whether they're Chinese, whether they're from the nobility, whether they're a commoner, male or female, and then also marital status. So this is basically what these deeds look like. So I'll go back here. A little trouble with my keyboard, sorry about that. These are what these deeds look like. So they're actually in a tear sheet. And so the right side is where all the detail is written. We have the enumeration of the trees, and then the calculation of the taxes. The total tax rate is recorded here. All of the information then is recorded onto the government copy. And so the right side is torn out and given to the owner of the land. And then the left side is in a book that had 50 of these records. And that is actually what the government kept. And so the information that they had is the plot registration numbers, the location. This is a plots, it's actually a tie measurement of size of land, but then we also have the exact size that we can calculate with the traditional tie measurements. Border properties, so for example, this one was bordered by 3 other properties plus a canal. The annual tax assessment, and then the owners, which has information about their social class as well as their gender, and the registration date of the deed. If a deed had been transferred, they would have additional handwritten notes. And so this says the names of the people that the deed was transferred to. And so in this case, there's actually several people. It looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people that this was then co-owned after it was transferred. This is the transfer date, and then these are the details of the transfer itself. So just to give you an idea of the number of transfers that we found, about 13% of the properties that we have in Bangkok, and I have 11,322 properties in this data set. And fewer outside of Bangkok, so only 4% in the group that actually had transfer information. I just have under 10,000 of these deeds. Just to give you an idea of where these deeds are coming from, on the left side, we have the sample area within Thailand. And so the deeds actually cover 7 different provinces, but the transfer information only cover 4 provinces. And you can see the districts that are covered here. And that had to do with the fact that there clearly were 2 different clerks working, and one was very detailed about transfer information, the other one was not. And so I could only use the ones from one clerk, but not the other. But luckily that included Bangkok. And you can see the darker color means that there's kind of more land market activity or more transfers going on. And Bangkok is right here in the middle. It's the darkest. And of course, as we go out, it gets lighter, which means there's fewer transfers that are happening. This weird district over here, this is in Ratburi, and there's a lot of, I always think of this as like the homes of the rich and famous, is like the vacation homes, because most of the owners in this area in the records are actually the nobility. So I feel like there's a story there. I'm not quite sure what it is. And then if we focus in on Bangkok, because I will do some of the analysis just on Bangkok, again, we see the Grand Palace. This is the sort of the center of power, and the really dark areas. These are our commercial areas, and there's more land market activity in these commercial areas and less as you get further out. In terms of the timing of the transfers, we can see that after 1901, then there's a big spike in the land market activity. This is true both in Bangkok as well as outside of Bangkok. And so I just want to argue here that the land law actually mattered. In terms of methodology, I'm only going to show you one set of results here. So the goal is to find the relationship between the Land Act enactment in 1901 and the probability of a property transfer, and then also think about the characteristics of the property and whether properties with different types of characteristics are the ones being transferred after 1901. And so my dependent variable here is a property transfer, so it equals 1 if it's transferred and 0 otherwise over the period. And the dummy variables, the independent variables, the main one is this policy variable that equals 1 for periods after, on or after 1901. And then I also control for different property characteristics, including the total tax, which has something about productivity of this land, the area of the land, whether it's newly reserved land, and then what it borders, whether it borders a transportation canal, a river, road or bridge, irrigation canal, or a village or temple. We also control for owner characteristics, and in what I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to show you a version where I actually control for, to the best that I can, the macroeconomy. So I will be controlling for annual measures of rice exports in hundreds of thousands of metric tons. I'll be using a Cox proportional hazard model. And so what I want to do is basically model how long it takes for a transfer to happen from the time that the property is registered to the time that it is actually transferred. And so just a note on the construction of the data, I have almost 21,000 deeds that cover Bangkok and 3 other provinces, Samut Prakan, Nonthaburi, and Ratchaburi in the data set. And in this data set, we see 1,848 transfers, and that's my failure. And each property is actually observed annually from the registration date until either it's transferred. And at the moment, I've only got it set up as single failure data. I have not been able to update it yet to multiple failure, because some of these properties actually are transferred more than once. And then the property falls out of observation and is censored in 1908, because that's when these deeds go out of use. The total number of plot year observations then is just over 400,000. And the time varying covariates that I have are the policy variable that equals 1 for all periods after 1901. And then I have this macroeconomic variable, which is the rice exports, where these particular provinces in Bangkok are very much so intimately tied with the rice agriculture and rice exports. And so their economies kind of go up and down with that particular export. And it is the most important export at the time. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to the results. And I realize I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go quite quickly through this. So I just want to show you that both for Bangkok and outside of Bangkok, we see that the hazard of a transfer increases about 5-fold for Bangkok and 9-fold for outside of Bangkok. And so this is very consistent with that histogram that I showed you. So after the policy, we are more likely to see across the board more transfers. And we also see that, at least for Bangkok, the transfers are actually sensitive to the macroeconomy. The other thing that I was really interested in is that, do we see these properties that should have more commercial value, do we see them transacted more after the policy is enacted? And that's exactly what we see. Properties that are bordering rivers and roads or bridges tend to be transferred at higher rates than those that are not. And this is only true after the policy is enacted. We do not see the same thing outside of Bangkok. So this is really a Bangkok effect. The last thing I want to show you, because again, this is cool data, and part of the reason why this project has taken so darn long. Another thing that I did was actually collected the postal census of Bangkok from 1883. This is the first listing of all households in Bangkok. It was for the purposes of assigning addresses for the very first mail delivery system that was set up by the government. we've digitized 29,247 household listings across 3 volumes. And one of the cool things about this is actually lists the occupation of the household head in most cases. And so, for example, this says that this is a bitter leaf cultivator in this particular household. And so what I've done is I've geocoded each of these addresses, and then calculated a measure of the percentage of households that are engaged in agriculture. It's a bit rough, but I think it gives a fairly good estimate. It makes sense when I look at this map that the most agriculture being done is further out of the city, and then the administrative and commercial centers are much less involved in agriculture. And I just want to zoom in here, this little red portion. We can actually look at a land use map of Bangkok from 1896, and we can see that there's a lot of, this is agriculture, this is all orchards out here, these are orchards, but then we can see a lot of commercial buildings all along the river here. This is the Grand Palace here, more orchards, these are rice paddies. And this is a taro field that is my university now. So we were basically a potato field back in 1896. Okay, so when we put in this control for Bangkok, because I only have this for Bangkok, we do find again that the policy variable is still large and statistically significant, but we also see that the hazard ratio here is less than 1, which means that there is sort of a lower hazard or lower probability of a transfer of properties that are in agricultural areas in Bangkok. Okay, so that is, these are my main findings, that land transfers are significantly less likely in agricultural areas, but this is only, I didn't show that, it's only after 1901. That's the important part. Okay, only after 1901. And again, this is consistent with the annulment of the agricultural land use as a prerequisite for secure property rights. And then my other results are quite consistent. So the overall conclusions are that the introduction of full private property rights in land in 1901 led to increased land market activity in Bangkok and to a lesser extent in surrounding provinces, and that the land activity in 1901 is associated with plot characteristics important to non-agricultural trade and commerce activities, but we only see this in Bangkok and not elsewhere. Okay, sorry, I had some technical difficulties with this, but there we go. That's presentation.
Well done, Jessica. We've got 6 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, for some questions or comments. Has anyone got a question or a comment? Oh, Pierre, I think you've got one.
Yes, thanks, Jessica, for your presentation. The question I have is whether all the land plots in the districts that for which you have data had a land title, or whether there were other plots that did not have a land title but were involved or not involved, for that matter, in the market for land before and after 1901. Because it could well be that if your data set only has a selection of land plots, that is land plots of farmers that could afford the cost of acquiring a land title deed, then yeah, you're missing some observations perhaps. The reason to ask this is that I've done some work on land titling in Indonesia, colonial Indonesia, and the big problem at the time with introducing something akin to a torrent system was the high cost of that system. The question was, who's going to bear that cost? Farmers had to carry some of the cost, and that was a disincentive for them to take out that was a disincentive for the introduction of a torrent system. How did that work in Thailand? Did all land plots have a land title deed or not?
That's a really good question, and one that we've been thinking about. When I say we, is that I've been working with, of course, Tanya Porn a lot on with this data. And from what I can tell from the traditional land rights, so the main data set that I used, is that we can actually plot the path of the census taker, or the person who's assessing, the tax taker actually. And so they go basically from plot to plot to plot. So this was a government census that was done in the 1880s. And so they do capture everything. This is a tax document. So of course they want to tax everything. So I'm pretty confident that the data from the 1880s is fairly complete for at least the districts and the ones that I have, because of course I don't have everything. So I don't think there's really a problem there. Now, we do know after 1901, there are problems. Now, I believe from some of the notes from the early Department of Land that anything that had been deeded by the government before was basically then issued. Those were the ones that were kind of cadastral surveyed first. And so it doesn't seem like the owners had to request the cadastral survey. That was done by the government for the existing deeds. So it seems that the data set that I have was most likely all then issued these new deeds after 1901. And like I said, this goes out of use in 1908. So it took them some time to kind of complete that and then phase that out. Now, I also have another paper on the issues further out from Bangkok. So the ones that were not actually issued necessarily the traditional deeds earlier on. A lot of them did not get the land title. And then we have corporations coming in and then basically claiming land that people were already on. So there's a huge issue with land rights security out in that area. And we still, to this day, have not cadastral surveyed the entire country. So it's very good in the middle part of the country around Bangkok, but terrible outside. So it seems like anything that was titled or was issued some sort of tax document or deed before 1901 is fine. Anything after is a problem, even today.
Jessica, I wonder if I could ask a question from the chair, or more perhaps make a comment, and I'd love to get your thoughts. I'm not overly familiar with the history that you've been talking about and Siam, but I am intrigued with the rationality for moving to a Western style land tenure system. Obviously, Thailand was one of the only Southeast Asian nations, I think, that wasn't colonised. And so they were very competent in terms of their international politics and navigating those structures. What was the playoff between instituting Western institutions such as the land tenure system and the extent to which the nobles, the royalty, the rich people could hold peasants on the land, if I can put it that way? And it seems that there's a reduction perhaps in control over those people in that land experienced by the elites. Does that make sense?
So I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the relationship between the nobles and the commoners. And there was corvée service. There was certain types of slavery. Most of that had been phased out even beforehand. But again, it's all under sort of this backdrop of modernizing and following sort of the Western route in terms of reducing slavery and things like that. There's some nice work that's been done by David Feeney, actually quite a long time ago, in the 1980s, about this, and really it became economically unviable to continue on with that system, the corvée system, and so on, so there's kind of this switch between the property rights in people to the property rights in land. And so that's kind of, I don't want to say it's a completely separate topic, but it is actually a topic that happens much earlier in the 19th century. And that's a much earlier kind of transition to a quote unquote Western type of institution. But it was an adoption of a Western institution that was already sort of in process, and it wasn't because it was a Western institution. It was kind of convenient to adopt that and say basically, we're civilized just like you. You see this word civilized a lot of the time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's an intriguing paper. We are out of time, but as usual, people can contact Jessica directly if you have any questions or comments. Thank you, Zhiwu, Pushkar and Jessica, for some great papers during this session. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Our next session, of course, is the Butland Lecture with Alison Bashford, and that starts at 3:45. and there is a link on the program to get you into the Zoom link there. Otherwise, we're signing off for this session for now. I'll see you in about 15 minutes, and thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.